Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Today, we're going to talk about blended learning. Let me explain what it is. As you know, historically, if you wanted to learn English in a school, you had to really go and sit there. You had to take some classes, you would go along to the school, you would have written material, and you would go back in the following week. Because of COVID and because of technology generally, many language schools in the world are moving towards some kind of e-education. Some platforms, like italki, use technology completely to educate people. But some language schools out there still want you to go and sit there for an hour. And when you go, you have your books and your classes. Maybe if you're lucky, you will also have an online presence. So the teacher might tell you, okay, here's your homework, but let's meet midweek for a chat. Or send your homework to me electronically. This is called blended learning. It's when you take the traditional approach to learning, sitting in a classroom, and you mix it with some kind of online presence. What do you think about that? What do you think about online learning compared to traditional learning? Do you think mixing both works? Well, for me personally, I've been working in e-learning only for quite some time now. It works very well compared to traditional learning. I don't need to run a language school. I don't need to work in a language school. I don't need to deal with paper. So all around, I think everyone benefits. And it's also a bit cheaper as well. Traditional classroom approaches were always about paper, pencil, and learning. And it's been quite painful for them to move into e-learning, even to use blended learning where they reach out a little bit online. The reason for that is partly because of cost and time. You know, language schools historically didn't really employ qualified teachers, they just employed students. When English people go on holiday, or if we go working away for 3 months into Europe or wherever, quite often we just become teachers because it's the only work that's available if you don't want to work in a bar, you know. So if you're thinking that your teacher in your language school is fully qualified and maybe has a certificate, you better think again because that's not always the case. Anyway, back to our subject of blended learning. Well, certainly if your teacher wants to meet you during the week online for a chat, or if you have an online class, it can't be bad, can it? Well, that depends. I think we have to look at quality rather than quantity. The good thing about being online is it becomes a little bit more individual. Even in a class of, let's say, 20 people, okay, that class of 20 people, if you're sitting in a class, can be very dull and boring. But if you're in a class of 20 online people, the class can be much more interesting. Why is that? Well, first of all, you're sitting in front of your computer and you're kind of ready to hear what he has to say. It's also much easier to approach the teacher online to ask him questions than perhaps doing it face to face. I think there's an issue of intimacy. Online somehow feels closer. It somehow feels more intuitive and more natural, and you're going to be more relaxed as well because you don't have to dress up. You don't have to worry about what other people are thinking of you. You don't really have to worry about your teacher's facial expressions because although you'll be seeing him on screen, it's very different from face to face. So if you're someone who's nervous about going to a class, then definitely some kind of blended education might be better for you, or even just going online completely. I have no doubt that in the future, language schools won't be around. Like other educational establishments, language schools are on the way out. They may take some form of an internet cafe in the future, where you all sit around the class with a screen or an iPad, although that's quite expensive for language schools, but more likely they'll just kind of vanish as more and more platforms appear online. A good example of blended education might be if, for example, your teacher gives you homework and asks you to submit it online. I think that's wonderful because it saves the environment, it saves paper, and it's probably going to be quicker. That's another reason why traditional language schools don't really like it so much, because there's an expectation that they'll have to turn around things like homework in a much quicker way. I wonder if you can think of an example of how your school uses blended education. Do they mix either e-commerce with e-lessons? E-commerce might be, for example, if you can book the class online. So the class is actually face-to-face in a classroom, but you book it on their website. That might be another example of blended education, or at least e-commerce. And if they're doing that, then they're obviously looking at ways on how to blend education as well. For those of you who know me, you'll know my feelings about traditional ways of learning. The problem with language schools has always been how cost effective they try to be, because by reducing their costs, you become a commodity. For example, if you, let's say, are a level of B1 or B2, now I don't believe that anyone really fits into these categories well, but let's just say your language school passes a judgment. You are B1. You need my B1 class. Okay, when that happens, let's say that you're the only B1, okay? So they have 20 C1 students and one B1. Do you really think they're going to run a class of B1 just for you? Of course not. A better way or a better approach for them would be to say, I think you're C1, so you can get into my C1 class. But they're only saying that to save money, you know? So it's these kind of little tricks which all businesses use, which reduce you to a kind of a commodity, you know? And then, of course, you pay for the book and everything else, you know? You have someone going through that book chapter by chapter, and you don't really get the chance to interact. It's a little bit, well, it just isn't really right, is it? Of course, you have your own responsibilities. You can't just rely on the language school to give you English, but they tend to be quite expensive. So as they move online, they should, in theory, be forced to reduce their charges also, because there's no overheads. So they'll be saving a lot of money on things like electricity, lighting, desks, chairs, and that simply becomes a computer with a teacher in front of it at home. So there's a lot of money being saved there. So if your language school does go into blended education, you should expect to see some change in their pricing model, I would think. I'm not a fan of traditional education. Blended education is good if the prices are right, but even better is online education, because you can tell the teacher what you want. You can ask the teacher how the class is going to be modeled for you, and you have much more control. So if you're looking for business English, you can have that. If you're looking for conversational English to go on a holiday, you can have that. If you're looking for a vocabulary spree, you can have that as well. But unfortunately, these things are not always available when you go to book an English class. Well, that's all from me. I'd be very interested to hear what you think of blended education, or how you think that education in the schools, traditional education, compares to e-education. Maybe you'd like to leave a comment for me. Thank you. See you. Goodbye.